Thank you for listening to Depictions Media Radio. Welcome to Policy and Rights, the show about human rights and government policy. Welcome back, everybody, to Policy and Rights here on Depictions Media Radio. I am your host, Michael Clogs. Climate change. Climate change is real. Let's be straight up about that. Our planet is warming up, and is warming up at a more alarming rate than what we originally thought. Experts are saying that we're not looking at simply a 1.5 degrees Celsius increase in temperature. We could be looking at a 2.7 degrees Celsius raise in planet temperature. And this could be disastrous for a lot of people who live on coastlines because of rising sea levels. And island nations could be dramatically affected. And there's a whole lot of things that just simply can happen with this new discovery in how far our temperature could be rising. The United Nations has been calling upon global leaders via the G7, the G20, to do things to affect and lower carbon emissions that create greenhouse gases. And in Canada and the United States, we are still seeing where the governments are subsidizing and keeping oil and gas businesses and the larger corporations afloat. And the claim is that, oh, well, they're the people that are going to lead us through because they're the energy sector. They're not energy, they're fuel. Let's be straight on that. That the energy sector, as they want to call themselves, are going to lead us through climate change. Well, the truth of the matter is maybe they are trying to slow the process down so they can increase their profit margins. There is going to come a time with climate change and global pandemics and things that we are going to have to look the other way against profit margins and economy, and that we're going to have to just simply get things done. This next series of segments that you're going to hear here on Policy and Rights is going to talk about climate change and economy, because for now we can maybe look at how we can marry jobs and green environments together so that we can have the economy, keep the economy that we have. But there is going to be a price that's going to have to be paid, and some of the things that we have been using and doing are probably going to have to leave, such as oil and gas as fuel. That we're going to have to find new renewable fuels, and we're going to have to find new ways of gathering energy, electrifying our homes, driving our cars down the street that do not involve fossil fuels. And the definition of energy sector is going to have to take a change. So let's listen to the segments from the United Nations on climate change as we get ready to head to the Glasgow summit on climate change. So you're going to hear a lot about the COP26, and that is the Glasgow Summit on climate change, that we have to start meeting our carbon gas reduction targets in order to keep the global temperature change at 2.7, because 2.7 is right now by 2030. No matter what we're going to do, that's where we're going to be. But there's a possibility by 2030 that we can have that it won't go past the 2.7 degrees Celsius. So let's listen to what these experts and delegations are going to be talking about when they get to Glasgow with the United Nations. Thank you for listening to Depictions Media Radio.
All right, good morning to all, and thank you for joining us today for the launch of the UN Environment Programme's Emissions Gap Report. The Secretary-General will make a few initial remarks, followed by UNEP's Executive Director, Inger Andersen, and then Anne Olhoof, the head of the Climate and Policy Planning of UNEP's DTU Partnership. The Secretary-General will then take a few questions on climate, and we will have to release him, but Ms. Andersen and Ms. Olhoof will stay to answer remaining questions. You know the drill. If you're off screen, if you're online, just put a question in the chat. Sir, you have the floor.
Ladies and gentlemen of the press, good morning. I welcome my colleague Inger Andersen, Executive Director of UNEP. And we are both here to keep sounding the alarm. Less than 1 week before COP26 in Glasgow, we are still on track for climate catastrophe, even with the last announcements that were made. The 2021 Emissions Gap Report shows that with the present nationally determined contributions and other firm commitments of countries around the world, we are indeed on track for a catastrophic global temperature rise of around 2.7 degrees Celsius. Now, even if the announcements of the last few days will materialize, we would still be on track to clearly more than 2 degrees Celsius. And these announcements are essentially about 2050. So it is not clear how they will be materialized. But even if these recent announcements would materialize, we would still be clearly above 2 degrees Celsius. So, as the title of this year's report puts it, the heat is on. And as the contents of the report show, the leadership we need is off. And far off. We know that humanity's future depends on keeping global temperature increase to 1.5 degrees Celsius by 2030. And we also know that so far, parties to the Paris Agreement are utterly failing to keep this target within reach. And the report also shows that countries are squandering a massive opportunity to invest COVID-19 fiscal and recovery resources in sustainable, cost-saving, planet-saving ways. So far, the report estimates that only about 20% of recovery investments will support the green economy. As world leaders prepare for COP26, this report is so another thundering wake-up call. How many more do we need? The recent IPCC report already showed that unless we reduce global carbon emissions by 45% from 2010 levels by 2030, 100 months from now, we will not reach a 1.5 degree future. And scientists are clear on the facts. Now leaders need to be just as clear in their actions. And they need to come to Glasgow with bold, time-bound, front-loaded plans to reach net zero, to decarbonize every sector, from power to transport, farming and forestry, to phase out coal by 2030 in OECD countries and 2040 in all others, to end all coal investment, public and private, national and international, to end subsidies for fossil fuels and polluting industries, to put a price on carbon, and to channel debt back to creating green jobs. And obviously, to provide at least $100 billion each year to the developing world for climate finance. The Paris Agreement says that the provision of scaled-up financial resources should aim to achieve a balance between adaptation and mitigation. And so, a balance means 50-50. And I repeat my call to donors and multilateral development banks to allocate at least 50% of their climate support towards adaptation and resilience. The clock is ticking. The emissions gap is the result of a leadership gap, but leaders can still make this a turning point to a greener future instead of a tipping point to climate catastrophe. The era of measures and hollow promises must end. The time for closing this leadership gap must begin in Glasgow. And I thank you for your attention. I'm at your disposal.
Thank you very much, sir. I now give the floor to Inger Andersen, the Executive Director of the UN Environment Programme. Inger?
Thank you so much. As you've just heard from the UN Secretary-General, the heat is very much on when it comes to climate change. 5 days ahead of COP26, climate action is still inadequate. The updated nationally determined contributions and other commitments for 2030, not officially submitted, only take another 7.5% beyond what has already been committed off. So we need to take a total of 55% of our current emission load on the least cost pathway to 1.5 degrees. And if we were to aim for 2 degrees, which we really shouldn't, we'd need to have an ambition of 30% reduction. But the report states we are at 7.5%. As the report demonstrates, the world would need 7 times more ambition to keep us on the 1.5 degree track. And this is a yawning gap that we must close in 8 years. 8 years in which we must increase ambition, make new plans, put in place new policies, implement them, and ultimately deliver the cuts. We can still get the job done, but only if we get moving now, and only if we take advantage of every opportunity. As the emissions gap report in 2021 shows, net zero pledges from 49 countries plus the EU cover half of all greenhouse gas emissions. These pledges could bring a predicted global warming this century down from 2.7 to 2.2, still off track but closer. But they remain ambiguous, vague, and inconsistent with 2030 action, and that must change too. Another option highlighted in the report is methane, a powerful and short-lived climate warming gas. Over 30 countries have joined the US and EU-led effort to cut 30% off of methane emissions by 2030. Such a target is a feasible, low-cost, and particularly through action in the oil and gas sector, which does exist. But rapid action on methane, while necessary, does not let the oil and gas industry off the hook. It is an interim measure on the road to decarbonization. The report also tells us that the opportunity, as we heard to use COVID-19 recovery financing for low carbon recovery has been largely missed so far, but that too can change. Meanwhile, carbon markets could accelerate action by decreasing mitigation costs if grounded in clear rules that ensure transactions reflect actual reductions in emissions. Carbon markets are a part of the much needed effort to provide financing to developing nations so that they can adapt to climate change and follow a low carbon development pathway. But they can't be all of it. We need more solidarity and more financing. Finally, as previous emission gap reports have shown, there's a huge climate potential in nature-based solutions, in renewables, and in energy efficiency, and in so much more. The point is that we know what we need to do, and we even know how to do it. We know the time frame in which we need to act. We know the benefits of action and the consequences of inaction. The case for climate change is essentially closed. So it's time to get it done. Through stronger commitments that use every option at our disposal, through policies and action. We need to go firm, we need to go fast, and we need to start doing it now. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Inger. Thank you. We'll now turn to Anne Olhoof, the head of climate policy and planning at UNEP. Anne? Yeah. Anne, are you connected? Can you hear us? Just give it a second.
Yes, I'm connected, and sorry for this. I just need to share my screen.
Great. All right. Please go ahead. Go. Okay.
So thank you very much. This is the 12th Emissions Gap Report produced as an independent scientific assessment to inform the international discussions on climate change. And this year is particularly interesting because it's the first year since the adoption of the Paris Agreement that countries have been requested to submit new or updated nationally determined contributions for 2030 in line with the 5-year ambition rating cycle of the agreement. Furthermore, one of the key goals of the upcoming negotiations in Glasgow is to ensure global net zero by around mid-century to keep 1.5 degrees within reach. So against this background, this brief presentation will zoom in on the 3 key questions that you might see on your screen. And we will look at first the impact of the new announced climate mitigation pledges for 2030, both on the emissions projections and also on the emissions gap in 2030. So by the time we're finalizing the report, 121 parties have submitted new or updated NDCs to the UNFCCC, and these cover more than half of global emissions. What we see in general is that these NDCs, the new and updated ones, are more transparent, and also that more of them include greenhouse gas emissions targets than prior NDCs. We also see that they do show progress in terms of enhancing ambition. However, the aggregate impact of these pledges is still relatively limited. So this graph basically shows you the contribution of the G20 members, the contributions of the non-G20 members, and also the contribution of announced pledges not submitted as NDCs at the time of the production of the report. And all in all, the new and updated NDCs are estimated to lower annual predicted greenhouse gas emissions by just under 3 gigatons of CO2 equivalents in 2030. If we also take into account the announced pledges, this reduction increases to just over 4 gigatons of CO2 equivalents. So while it actually narrows the gap slightly for the first time since 2015, since the Paris Agreement, it remains large. As you can see on this slide, the full implementation of unconditional NDCs and other pledges still leaves a gap of 11 to 13 gigatons of CO2 equivalents in 2030 with respect to a 2-degree pathway, and also a gap of between 25 to 28 gigatons of CO2 equivalents with respect to a 1.5-degree pathway. As Inge already highlighted, these new pledges shave off 7.5% in the projected emissions compared to previous pledges. And we would need 4 times higher ambition to get on track to 2 degrees and 7 times higher ambition to get on track to 1.5 degrees. Now, this doesn't take into account the net zero emission pledges that an increasing number of countries have put forward. 50 parties covering more than half of global greenhouse gas emissions have put forward such pledges by now. They still show quite a lot of ambiguity in terms of sectors and gases covered, whether or not they include and how they include offsets, and also in terms of transparency, both regarding the plans for achieving them, but also for how to report and review progress against them. So where does that take us in terms of global warming implications? The Emissions Gap Report 2021 estimates that a continuation of current policies would be consistent with global warming at the end of the century of around 2.8 degrees. And all of these estimates are with a 66% chance. If we fully implement the unconditional NDCs and the other announced pledges, this estimate is lowered to 2.7 degrees. But the real change happens if the 2030 pledges are implemented in combination with the net zero emissions target. As you can see here, the unconditional pledges in combination with the full achievement of net zero targets would bring us closer to the Paris Agreement temperature goal. But we're not yet there, and we have to get there. So what we can see is that few of the G20 members' pledges for 2030 actually put their emissions on a clear path towards net zero. And furthermore, as a group, the G20 members are not yet on track to either their previous NDCs nor their new ones. So there's an urgent need to raise ambition and accelerate action, both to bridge the emissions gap and also to get global emissions on track towards net zero. As Inga mentioned, the report covers a lot of other areas, and if we look into fiscal recovery, how to spend that well to accelerate a green transition, and we look into the opportunities for reducing emissions from methane and also into the use of market mechanisms. That's it from my side. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. We'll now take some question. Valeria, please, on behalf of UNCA.
Thank you so much, Stefan. Thank you, Mr. Secretary-General, on behalf of ANCA for this press conference. So my question is, how confident you are to be able to reach an agreement among states at COP26 on the objective to reduce greenhouse gas emission in the coming years, and how important is the fact that leaders like Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin will not attend the summit? Thank you so much.
I think all G20 leaders are very important because G20 represents 80% of the emissions. And obviously, there is still, as it was demonstrated, a huge effort to make in order to make sure that not only we reach net zero emissions in 2050 globally, but that there is a meaningful reduction of emissions in the next decades. If there is no meaningful reduction of emissions in the next decade, we will have lost forever the possibility of reaching 1.5 degrees. So this is a moment of truth, and I will be joining the G20 next weekend, and I will be strongly appealing for all of them to do their maximum. There is a principle of national determined, common but differentiated responsibilities according to national capabilities, which means that the leadership must come from developed countries, but the level of emissions of the emerging economies is such that we also need the emerging economies to go an extra mile. Only if everybody does the maximum, it will be possible to get there.
Thank you. Pamela Falk, CBS News.
Thank you, Secretary General, and to UNEP for the briefing. My question is, the report does say that national plans have fallen short. And there's some countries, like China, that have pledged to cut fossil fuel, but there are no new pledges on the emissions. How can you get countries to do both at the same time, and do you expect that to happen at COP26? Thank you.
Well, first of all, China, like several other countries, have not yet presented their national determined contributions. And my appeal to China is very simple. What President Xi Jinping announced in the General Assembly is that they would reach net zero before 2060, and they will peak the emissions before 2030. And before is the magic word. I think it is very important to make this before as big as possible, because that would be a very important contribution to make our global objectives be met, and that would have an influence on several other countries that are now making pledges in relation to net zero in 2060. And so it's important to encourage everybody to do more.
Thank you. Margaret Bashir.
Secretary-General, Margaret Bashir, Voice of America. I'm sorry to just, if you'll indulge me for one moment, it's very important that we have you on camera and on the record about Sudan. If you could just say a few words about the situation, and what have you learned from the situation in Myanmar, which we are now 9 months into and 1,100 lives lost, where there's been a military coup. What does the international community, and specifically the United Nations, need to do differently to reverse the situation in Sudan?
Well, first of all, about Sudan. I once again strongly condemned the forceful military takeover of power in Sudan. And I urge, of course, all stakeholders to exercise maximum restraint, but the Prime Minister and other officials that were unlawfully detained must be released immediately. And it's true that Sudan has achieved important milestones. They cannot be reversed. And so it is essential that all transitional arrangements and institutions as defined in the constitutional document be reinstated. The civilian-military partnership is critical. It needs to be re-established at the level with which it was established. And I think the Sudanese people has shown very clearly their intense desire for reform and democracy. Now, we are seeing a multiplication of coups d'etats. The fact that we have strong geopolitical divides, the fact that the Security Council has lots of difficulties in taking strong measures, the impact of the problems of COVID and the difficulties that many countries face from the economic and social point of view, these three factors are creating an environment in which some military leaders feel that they have total impunity, they can do whatever they want, because nothing will happen to them. And my appeal, obviously, is for especially the big powers to come together for the unity of the Security Council in order to make sure that there is effective deterrence in relation to this epidemic of coups d'etats. And we have seen that effective deterrence today is not in place. We have seen it in Myanmar, and we have also seen it in several African locations.
Sherwin Bryce Pease, South African Broadcasting.
Morning, Secretary General. Back to COP26. You've talked about the trust deficit between the developing world and the developed countries, and this comes down in large part to the $100 billion you talk about annually, but we do know that developing countries, led by countries like South Africa, are pushing for this to go up to $750 billion a year come 2025. The concern is in 2020, the deadline for that fund to be capacitated was not reached. How are you going to get a firm commitment from the industrial nations to reach the 750, given that they can't even reach the 100 billion that was due in 2020?
As you probably know, yesterday It was published by Ministers Flasbart and Wilkinson that have been charged to prepare a delivery plan on 100 billion. And I would like to express my deep gratitude and appreciation to both of them for the work that they have established. They have presented a report. The report is accompanied by some projections by OECD. I think that they represent a serious contribution, and they deserve a serious analysis and a serious consideration, because what matters, obviously, is the effective delivery of the 100 billion. And I've been campaigning for the need for that delivery, and I hope that this step will help move in that direction.
Thank you. One last question.
It's not enough to have 100 billion. It's necessary also to mobilize more resources from the multilateral development banks, from the private sector, and it is also essential that contributions are more based on grants than loans, and it is also essential that there is an effective balance between adaptation and mitigation.
Thank you. Kirsten Salome, Al Jazeera.
Thank you, Secretary General. Given you're headed to the G20, those nations responsible for 80% of carbon emissions, can you sum up where their NDCs stand, how many have announced them, and what do you need to get from them this weekend? And also, the United States, UN's largest funder, the world's second largest carbon emitter, can't seem to agree on a budget. What is at stake in the U.S. budget negotiations for COP? What do you need to see in there, do you think? How will that affect what's going to happen at COP?
Obviously, it will be impossible to reach 100 billion without a meaningful American financial contribution. That is evident. And my appeal to the American institutions is to make sure that that meaningful contribution can materialize. Obviously, all G20 leaders must understand the need that they need to do the maximum. I cannot tell you exactly how many countries have not yet presented national determined contributions, but I think that probably around almost half of the countries have not presented national determined contributions. Some made announcements of objectives, but obviously an announcement for 2060 without a program of action to get there has the value that it has. So it is absolutely essential that all G20 countries present before Glasgow or in Glasgow national determined contributions that are compatible with 1.5.
Thank you. One last question, and then we have to let the Secretary General go, but we'll continue on with Ms. Anderson. Celia, Voice of America.
Thank you. Secretary General, in the report, how do you see the relation between migration, forced migration, and climate change? We know Latin America and Guatemala, the dry corridor is one of the areas, and we have seen now massive movements from South America all the way to Mexico. How do you see that, especially because you have experience with refugees, and what's your take on that and how the world leaders could make a change?
I think climate change is clearly an important accelerator of migration. In some situations, because several regions become simply not inhabitable anymore, and so people have to leave because they have no conditions to survive. Desertification, as you know, is progressing in many areas. On the other hand, several habitats are being impacted, and the resources that are available in those habitats are also forcing people to leave because they cannot find opportunities and they cannot find even sometimes the minimum conditions of food security in particular. On the other hand, climate change accelerates other factors, including factors that can lead to conflict. In many places of the world, particularly in Africa, look at the Sahel, we have farmers and herders, and the relationship between farmers and herders can be harmonious, but when resources dwindle, water becomes more scarce, they tend to enter into conflict. And so climate change, again, is an accelerator of conflict. It's not the only cause, but it's an accelerator of conflict, and conflict drives displacement. So it is clear for me that climate change is today one of the most important factors in the acceleration of migration movements.
So thank you very much. I know we have to let the Secretary General go. He has another climate speech in front of the General Assembly.
I have the General Assembly.
Yes, exactly. More climate. But we are delighted to stay with Inger Anderson and Anne Hulhoff, who will continue to take questions on the report. I think I'll turn to Joe Klein from Canada Free Press. Joe.
Yes, thank you. The Secretary General has called for OECD countries to phase out coal by 2030. Yet, despite his pledge to no longer build new coal-fired power projects abroad, China is continuing to add dozens of coal-fired electric power plants at home. So I'd like to know what your message is to China, the largest emitter of greenhouse gases, concerning its announced increase in coal mining and the building of coal-fired plants at home. And to what extent has the GAP report taken China's announcement of new coal-fired plants into account in its objectives? Thank you.
Thank you. Maybe I start here, if I can, Stefan. And essentially what we would say is, first of all, we would encourage all countries, as the Secretary General has done, to step out of coal. That becomes critical. The report before you does take into account all the announceables that have been made, both in terms of the net zero pledges as well as in terms of the NDCs. 2 weeks ago, we issued a report we called the Production Gap Report, where we look at what our country is planning to do in terms of their production of gas, coal, and oil. And in that report, not today's report, but the report that we released just a short time ago, we show that governments, and this includes China, but let me hasten to add, are planning and projecting 240% more coal, 57% more oil, and 71% more gas. So whilst that's not the topic of this press conference, the truth is that we are not where we need to be with respect to the hydrocarbon sector, and it becomes absolutely critical because we shouldn't be whistling out of two sides of our mouth here. And the pledges that have been made need to be reflected in the NDCs and need to therefore provide domestically the policy guardrails for new exploration that is intended. Stefan?
Thank you. Thank you very much. We'll now go to Dong Liu from Chinese media. Dong Liu. Okay, let's try Urmi from the Economic Times of India. Urmi, can you hear us? Okay, we're not having much luck. Mr. McCarthy, I can see you, so please go ahead. If you could introduce yourself as well.
Can you hear me?
Yes, if you could introduce yourself. Thank you.
Thank you. It's Danica McCarthy from The Independent London. My question is, in the light of today's disastrous emissions gap, the International Energy Agency said we should have an immediate ban on all fossil fuel investments, coal, gas and oil from this year, if we're to achieve net zero 2020. So my question is, why is UNDP or the Secretary General not calling on the COP to implement the IEA ban on all new investments in fossil fuels? Thank you.
If I may, I think what we are saying here is that we need to step out and step down from hydrocarbons, and that we need to also figure out how we are making that transition. And what that will entail is to avoid that we have energy shortages, as we are seeing in some places now, is that we enable proactive engagement for investment in renewable. And that is done by government policies, and that is done by incentivizing, and that is done by banks leaning in and by ensuring that we have these longer term investments. At this point, calling for an end for certain fossil fuel investments is, of course, a clear call from IEA when they look at the trajectory, and we understand that. However, we are in that process of transition, and right now what we want to see is clarity in the NDCs and clarity in the net zero commitments that have been made, so that there is no fudging and no vagueness around what the promises are. And further, as we heard from the Secretary-General, we are not doing ourselves a favor by kicking the net zero can down the road to 2050. We need to see real action between now and 2030. That's what we're calling for at the COP.
Is that not a fudge by you?
I think if the time when we have the opportunity to turn off all fossil fuel and everyone still has lightings and the hospitals are still working, I think at that point, indeed, yes. But right now, we're not seeing the investments, which we have to see. And so the imperative now is on focusing on investing in the three sectors that are the biggest carbon emitters. It is energy, it is transport, and it is infrastructure and buildings in cities. These are the three sectors that we're focusing on, and these are the three sectors that need to make these shifts.
Thank you.
But if we invest $5 trillion in new fossil fuels, what hope have we got of net zero?
Stefan, do you want me to come back? I can come back, but we can take it into a dialogue.
Yeah, exactly. Let's move on. Hilde de Wachter from EcoTips.
Yes, hello. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Yeah, okay. Yes, I was wondering, the report is based on what countries are going to do or are not going to do, but what can companies, what can businesses do individually or in their sector to help closing the gap? What is their role?
Clearly here, I think what we're looking for is that businesses lean in on net zero, lean in on shifting their portfolios, lean in on transparently reporting on their carbon footprint in their production in the entire supply chain. This is not happening now, in part because there are so many methods by which businesses calculate this. So looking at finding similarity and ensuring that we have an equal playing field for reporting on carbon footprint and not using greenwashing, etc. We are looking very much at the big investment portfolios that we see in the financial sector, because that is where the big shifts will be coming up. And we are hoping very much to see at COP26 some announceables from the financial sector that is obviously the biggest investors in fossil fuel that needs to shift its investments out. But we have to understand that these are your mortgages and mine. This is not easy to do. Because one thing is to shift out of hydrocarbon investments for production, but the broader issue is shifting out of the overall carbon footprint. And that is complex and will also put a degree of burden on those taking these loans through banking sectors.
Thank you. Neil Kamal from the Times of India. Neil?
Good evening.
Yes, we can.
So now when the word is at the please. Now, as the world is at the doorstep of very crucial global climate summit at a time when the climate crisis having been turning into climate emergency, necessitating emergent actions. Do we think that the nations are ready to take the corrective measures to reduce the GHG emission in the real sense, not only making shallow claims? Are the rich nations ready to pay the committed $100 billion as assured for poor nations? So how much hopeful you are from the outcome of this summit?
At this point, we've reached 80 billion. It's not where we want to be. And as we just heard also, of course, that is very much the floor. So it's very clear that for climate justice, for equity, for intergenerational justice, and to make the transition and to enable these investments to go into the developing world, we will need to ensure that we have the 100 billion. This was first mentioned in Copenhagen in 2009 at COP15. It is not news to donor countries that 100 billion would need to be on the table by 2020. So at this point, the UN is unequivocally calling for this finance. We're also, as we heard from the Secretary-General, calling for multilateral development banks and all other investors to lean in, and for a significant part of this to be grant-based. But talking about positive and hopeful, look, the hope is in action. The hope is in making these things real. Promises and pledges, yes, we appreciate that, but it will mean holding them in, as we heard from the SG, to the NDCs. In Glasgow, we need to work out with 100 billion, with a clarity over how we land on the stretched NDCs, so that we are clear over that. We need to walk out with clarity on Article 6 and carbon markets. And we need to walk out clarity to ensure that we have breakthrough on adaptation, ensuring that there's financing both for mitigation, for adaptation.
Thank you. I think we have time for one last question. Joe Klein, you had a follow-up. Joe, go ahead.
Yes, thank you. To your knowledge, are any UN agencies, such as the UN Development Program, like the Global Climate Fund itself, in any way financing projects in which fossil fuel production or use are still involved, other than trying to eliminate such production and use? Thank you.
I would very much doubt this, but I will ask Anne, maybe she can weigh in on this, but I don't have the full portfolio. I would very much doubt this.
I wouldn't know. I would also hope that that is not the case, and I would also doubt it.
Great. Thank you. On that hopeful note, Inger, I want to thank you very much, and I also want to thank you and all of you for tuning in. And I know all the report and all its information can be found on the UNEP website. Thank you all and have a good day.
Thank you for listening to Depictions Media Radio.
Very much for joining us today. I'm delighted to have Ambassador Woodward, the permanent representative of the United Kingdom, and Ambassador Loteru, the permanent representative of Samoa and chair of the Pacific Small Island Developing States, with us today to talk about the climate conference in Glasgow. Both ambassadors will be travelling to Glasgow, and so this is your last opportunity to talk to them about what we need to achieve collectively at the climate talks this weekend. So I will hand over to the ambassadors for some opening remarks, and then we will take questions from all of you. For those of you who are online, thank you for joining us, and if you could just indicate in the chat that you'd like to ask a question. So Ambassador Woodward, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Carl, for joining me today. Good morning, everybody. It's very good to see you, and thank you for your interest in COP in Glasgow. Opens on Sunday. I'm flying this afternoon, so I'm delighted to see you. I think we should start off by saying the stakes are very high, and we know that. Our ambition is to keep 1.5 alive, And as you know, that means limiting the rise in global temperature to 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial level. And this is an existential question. We've heard it from David Attenborough, we've heard it from Greta Thunberg, we've heard it from Nick Stern and so many other people. But I'm more than delighted that Power is joining me today, because this is truly existential for the small island developing states. And countries like Samoa are absolutely at the forefront of a crisis which they did not create. Those who have contributed least, like Samoa, are really doing the most so far in response. And already we've seen 21 small island developing states submit enhanced NDCs, and we very much welcome that. Now, the good news about COP is three things, I think. The first is, as the IPCC have told us, success is still possible. And that's very important as we go into Sunday's conference. The second thing I want to highlight is the deep commitment of my Prime Minister as the co-host of COP. And not just a personal commitment, but a national commitment. Last week, the UK published its net zero strategy, and the Prime Minister highlighted that this is about a competitive economic edge. So for all the challenges of building back from the COVID pandemic, we are looking to grow our economy and lower our emissions. And that's what we have been doing over the last few years. As part of that, we've also launched ahead of COP the Breakthrough Agenda, inviting leaders to join specific commitments to break through in the most challenging sectors. So the sectors like power, where coal is a particular problem, transportation, where road transport really needs a hard look if we're going to succeed at COP, hydrogen, again, part of the energy mix, and of course steel, as well as other difficult to attack industries. Third reason for optimism, I think, is that we go into G20 summit this weekend with our partners in COP, Italy, chairing the G20 summit. As you know, 80% of global emissions come from G20 countries. When the UK started as preparing as chair of COP, about 30% of global emissions were covered by NDCs and emissions restrictions. We've got that to 80%, but we need to move further. And we'll have a real push at G20 this weekend to get more commitments to net zero over the line. But, and this is why things turn on a knife edge and why Glasgow is such an important conference, we are, as we know, at the point of no return. So emitters cannot put their heads in the sand any longer. And the gap that we have between the nationally determined contributions that we need and those we've got delivered, between the pledges we've got and the policies that will underpin them, still leave us with a big gap in what my Prime Minister calls cash, cars, coal and trees. So the finance that we need, moving from combustion engine to electric powered vehicles, moving away from coal and planting trees to give us back the lung that our planet needs. So there's a gap there. And we do need the money. And I want to emphasise this because we made the commitment, as you know, in Paris to raise 100 billion. We haven't quite got there. We think we'll get there late 22, early 2023. We'll continue to do our best to raise that money. We've seen pledges from the US alongside our own pledge, the UK, and a pledge from the EU and many other pledges coming forward. But the most important thing, I think, is to continue focusing on the money, but also to adapt our business models so that we can really get the money out of the door. We need to move forward on the adaptation and mitigation projects that countries need in order to protect themselves from climate change. So my final point would be, am I optimistic? I am hopeful. I'm hopeful and optimistic as we go into Glasgow. Leaders around the world, we have 140 leaders coming to Glasgow in person, have this at the top of their agenda, and we do have an opportunity to keep 1.5 alive in Glasgow. I'll stop there and hand over to you, Pal.
Thank you very much, Barbara. Let me thank you for extending an invitation to Samoa and also on behalf of the PSITS. I firstly want to acknowledge and say that it's a tremendous effort on part of your government to organize this COP26 under very, very difficult situation. And I think, as you rightly put it, doing very challenging and unprecedented times. I think part of our challenge from small island Pacific countries is, of course, attendance at the highest level. But out of 14 of our Pacific Island developing countries, 13 countries will be represented. 4 at the head of state and government level, 2 at ministerial, 2 from officials coming from capital, and then 5 will be represented by ambassadors from New York and other embassies. But let me perhaps just say a few things about our expectation of the outcome of COP26. I think some of these are very much in line with what Barbara had already mentioned. On the 1.5 degree, for us that is not negotiable. For us that is a red line that we cannot and must not cross. I think the implication and the consequences of going beyond that is not something that I think we should anticipate, and it would be catastrophic for not only us in the Pacific, but for everyone. On the zero emission target for 2050, our expectation is that we hope countries will make pledges in terms of subsidies. Those need to be phased out correspondingly. We like to see an increase in funding for adaptation. We welcome a number of countries who have indicated that they will not support the creation or establishment of coal power plants overseas. I think that is something that is positive, and we want to see more countries join, as well as perhaps gradually reducing the number of coal power plants in their own countries. I think we understand that the transition that needs to be made will take some time, and I think we appreciate that. On finance, the 100 billion is the first step for us. I think that's very important, but equally important is that over the next 9 years, we want a continuation or raising the level of ambition in terms of financing. For us in the Pacific, we receive currently 0.5% of climate finance. But as Barbara rightly pointed out, we suffer the most in terms of the impact. So we look forward to perhaps getting a little bit more of the funding in the future. Real money. I think our concern has been when pledges are made, it goes from one pocket to the other. But we would like to see real money being added. We understand the difficulty, but I think if we are going to address this issue, then we will need to look at those options, including SDR. I think there is the issue of blending, the engagement of the World Bank and the IMF, to mention a few. And tied to that is we want to see the finalization of the Paris rule book. I think that that's important for implementation purposes. There's no use having additional funding and then those are not being used. So we need to get those funding on the ground in terms of mitigation and adaptation activities. Two more points. One is that we firmly believe that the engagement and the leadership of the G20 is extremely important. I think Barbara has mentioned that they're responsible for 80% of the emission. So I think it's time that they live up to their commitment and pledges that they have made. And then finally, on ocean. This is an area that of critical importance to us in the Pacific for obvious reasons. We're surrounded by it. It links all our countries together, but there are also implications. The nexus between climate change and sea level rise will have implication for our small island states in the future in terms of loss of statehood as well as sovereignty, erosion of our maritime zone, etc., etc. So we want to see that at least being seriously considered. I know it's being part of the ILC and the 6th committee work, but I think we would like to see more focus on that and urgency in terms of its treatment. Thank you very much.
Thank you, ambassadors. And now we'll take questions from the floor and then some from the chat. Edie, please.
Thank you very much, Edith Lederer from the Associated Press, and on behalf of the United Nations Correspondents Association, thank you for doing this briefing. My question is to both of you. The original plan was to have $100 billion every year starting in 2020. Here we are in nearing the end of 2021, and we don't even have the first 100 billion. What is your assessment of why this money has been so slow in forthcoming?
Thanks, Edie, for that question. I think there's no doubt about the importance of that commitment in Paris to the 100 billion. And it's important, first of all, because we need the money, but it's an important signal because we need a lot more than 100 billion. We know that. We'll probably need several more 100 billion behind that, and probably even into trillions when you factor in the market and the business requirements as well. Why has it been slow? I think we certainly haven't been helped by the global economic slowdown following COVID, partly because countries have turned inwards, I think, to put their own economies back on track rather than focusing on the wider needs of the planet. But I've been very encouraged by the significant contributions we've seen. So we saw President Biden announce over 11 billion here at UNGA just back in September. The UK has put more than 11 billion into the contributions. The EU has put 4 billion euros in, and other countries have made contributions. So I think we've seen a momentum in recent months towards the 100 billion. Behind that, I think we have raised a significant awareness at the IFIs in particular of the greater need. And I know that many businesses, many financiers, including people like Mark Carney, have been working on financial mechanisms in the private sector. So there will be money. But as Paul said, this can't be about pledges. It's got to be about real money turning into real mitigation and adaptation projects. It doesn't matter whether it's renewable energy technology, switching grids over, just transitions for coal miners. That's also what we've got to do. So we will continue to work towards the money, but we also need to make sure the money goes out the door and into projects that will change the climate. That would be my thought.
Thank you very much. I don't have much to add to that. I think, the COVID had introduced a new element into the equation. The pledges were made, in 2015 or thereabouts, and I think a number of development has occurred. But I think what is important is what Papua has said, that recently we've had indication or clear commitment on the part of a number of countries. I think the US has made a very substantial pledge in terms of doubling their earlier in 2021 commitment. The EU, with 4 billion up to 2027. So I think and others have joined. Denmark and I think Sweden have pledged, substantial increases. And I think that is important. I think also, as I said earlier on, we also need to look at the situation where the funds are not, unlimited. So if you take from one pocket, something has to go without on the other. But I think the issue of climate change is so important that I think we need to look at new funding. And I think that there are plans in the pipeline for that possibility. So I think, as Barbara said, I think we need to be hopeful. I think to take a different position will not be helpful at this stage. Thank you.
Celia.
Celia Davaren, Africa Confidential. Climate change is a must. However, what can you do for countries in conflict or at war, where population, their main goal is to find something to eat, somewhere to live? They don't care about climate change. They care about their life and surviving. So what can you do for them?
So thank you for that question. And I would say that speaks to the heart of why the UK has been one of the champions of questions around climate security in the Security Council itself, because we recognise that so much conflict now is at its heart driven by climate change. And as you say, when you see drought, you see fights for land, you see swarms of locusts, you see flooding, all of those things are drivers of conflict and then lead to the humanitarian disasters that you are referring to. So what can we do for those people? Immediately, of course, we can do our very best through humanitarian aid, and I pay tribute to the work that OCHA does. But I do think we need to get behind that and to get more deeply into questions of climate security, because those are the questions that are driving so many of the conflicts that we see today. Thanks.
I just want to add perhaps a slightly different angle to what you said. Perhaps, again, in the context of Pacific Island countries, we are in a similar situation if you take the impact of climate change. So the question for us is, do you then use the funding that is available to deal with the impacts of climate change at the expense of our basic needs? And I think you refer to that. Not only basic needs in terms of food, et cetera, but the social aspect of our country. So those are difficult questions, and it's similar to what's happening in countries under conflict and war. But I think we need, as a collective, I think one of the things we got to remember is that climate change is now a global issue. And I think it requires all of us to work together if we are going to address this situation.
Question online, and then we'll come back to the room. So, Michelle, over to you.
Thank you. Thanks, Margot, and thanks, ambassadors, for the briefing. Ambassador Woodward, a question for you specifically about Glasgow. Have the Chinese indicated at all whether President Xi might join by video? And are there concerns that China, given sort of the recent announcements from China, including those that were made at the UN General Assembly, are there concerns that China may not have anything left to offer? Thanks.
Important thing to say is that this is an in-person summit. So we have been very clear as hosts that we welcome everyone to participate, but it will be in person. We've got around 140 global leaders coming in person. The Chinese have indicated that they'll be represented by their lead climate negotiator, Xie Zhenhua. So we understand that President Xi Jinping will not be coming. But we did note with great interest the climate strategy that China published earlier this week, which set out very clearly how they plan to meet the targets that they've set of by 2030 and by 2060. So there's some quite specific plans set out in that, and we'll have no doubt have an opportunity to discuss them further at the G20. Thanks.
A question from Benno.
Thank you, Mangu. Thank you, ambassadors. Benno Schinghammer with the German press agency. Ambassador, I don't know if you can speak about that or how much you can speak about that, but could you maybe outline what kind of concrete impact climate change has on Samoa right now and how it might turn out if the 1.5 degree aim is not met?
Well, I can go all day, but I don't think we have the time. But let me perhaps deal with the impact, the nexus between climate change and the ocean, because that is important for us. Climate change, if we go beyond this 1.5, the impact of warming will affect our reef ecosystem, for example. It will affect fishery, which a lot of our coastal population depend on. So it's a source of livelihood will be affected. And that is happening at the moment. When you look at some of our population around the coast, that it's all around the islands. They're finding it very difficult to secure what we used to secure in the past. So that's going to affect the population, their livelihood, and also nutrition. And that's going to be very, very difficult. Climate change also in terms of sea level rise, for instance. That's going to impact, if you look at agriculture, it raises the water, the sea level, and that's going to affect the salinity of the soil, and therefore agriculture will be compromised in terms of food production, etc., etc. It will also affect, the population, especially those on the coastal side. So then now they have to move inland, and that create problems for us as well, because for some of our islands, especially the volcanic one, and your question was specifically to Samoa, that means that we have to move to higher ground. So that again is another implication of climate change. So I think just on those I can go on. It will also impact when we talk about loss and damage in terms of cyclones, the frequency and severity of those. It just devastate our development. It just takes a couple of days of cyclone and everything is gone. Not only physical, but also the lives of some of our people. So it's a difficult situation. It's even worse for our atoll island states, sister state like Kiribati and Tuvalu, for example. half a meter of sea level rise will devastate those two countries. They will just go under. So those are unfortunately, that is what's happening. And we have to deal with those on an everyday basis. It's not like something that we're just sort of talking about. It's not an academic question for us. It's a reality, and we're living it every day. Thank you.
Majid and then Kristen.
Thank you. Thank you, both of you, for this briefing. Ambassador, one of the consequences of climate change is somewhat the use of it's one of the consequences, which is the water shortage and drought, strategically by some powerful countries against weaker countries. We are seeing that, for example, between what Iran is doing with water source with Iraq, or Turkey is doing with Syria and Iraq, or with even between near future between Palestinians and Israelis. On this political issue, do you think the international community can take some measures that could have concrete impact in order to limit the use of the impact of climate change by powerful countries as an advantage against the weaker countries? Thank you.
Do you want me to start?
I
think, can I tease out two questions from what you've said? The first is just to underline the importance of water. We know all around the world, whether it is for islands, both from island nations, or rivers, how desperately humanity depends on water and how much that is declining. So there are convincing arguments being made that actually water shortages are going to be absolutely critical as we go forward in the coming decades. So I think you've hit a really important question. On the question of weaponizing climate change and water, I think the point that you made about rivers is a very good one, and it's not always the powerful. It's often depending on where you are in the passage of the river, as it were. And there are UN mechanisms that deal with international mechanisms, as well as regional ones that deal with fair and equitable handling of dams, which is what it basically comes down to. It's something that we have actually discussed a bit in the Security Council. We had a discussion about the Ethiopian Grand Renaissance Dam. I think our view was that was a very important briefing for all of us, but it is probably better that the local regional parties to the river, to the dispute or discussion, are the ones who need to solve it. So that was the spirit in which we concluded. But I agree with you, we do need to find ways of amicably making sure that as resources dwindle, we have fair access to them and they aren't weaponised.
I think we have time for one more question. That's for Kristen.
Hi, Kristen Salumi from Al Jazeera English. Thanks for the briefing. The UN just released a study that says $243 billion is still going to subsidize the fossil fuel industry from governments. And I'm wondering, since you're struggling to come up with $100 billion, it may be a naive question here in the halls of power, but the casual observer would say, why can't we just switch that money over? Why can't we do that? Madam Ambassador, do you want to take a stab at that? And Mr. Ambassador, how does it make you feel when you hear those numbers?
But I think it goes to the heart of what you said earlier, Pat, which is this can't be about pledges, it has to be about real money. So let's not lose sight of that. I think that it also goes to the heart of what you said earlier, Pat. We recognise that some countries are very dependent on fossil fuels for energy security, and that, of course, holds up jobs and therefore the economy. So it is not possible to make a sudden cut-off, but it is possible to continue to move in the right direction. And that's why we all welcome the announcements of no new international coal funding that we've seen from China, we've seen from Japan and Korea. But, as Paul said, we now need those translated into domestic arrangements. And we've managed to do that in the UK. We're still waiting to see how that can happen. And the G20 discussions, well, I think will be another very important point. So I agree with you, the maths looks very tempting, and but it's not going to be quite as simple as that. But those numbers are pretty telling about the importance, but also I think the challenge that we need to unpick to make that transition work. Thanks.
Okay, thank you for listening today. And you've heard several segments on climate change and how it's going to have an effect on us. We could be looking at not only just increased temperatures, but along with those increased temperatures, we're looking at shorter growth cycles for food. We also could be looking at increased diseases like we're experiencing now with the global pandemic with COVID-19, that there could be more of those sort of things that come down the way. And we have to be vigilant. We have to start taking action now as citizens, and we also have to write back to our governments that we don't want to see any more subsidies going towards the oil and gas sector. We want to see subsidies going towards businesses that are trying to find renewable ways of creating energy and renewable ways of resources, so that we don't have to mine as much, and that we can be a little more sustainable and self-sufficient on what we've already mined from our planet as it is. So you've been listening to Policy and Rights here on Depictions Media Radio, and I have been your host, Michael Clocks. Thank you for listening today, and thank you for supporting us with our sponsors. Please go to depictions.media for more information, and click on our contact link and let us know how we can help bring your story and help bring us to a better world. This show has been produced by Depictions Media. Please contact us at depictions.media for more information.